This video was brought to you by CuriosityStream, which is, just for this week, at its cheapest price ever of $11.59 a year. Get access to bonus TLDR content and all of our videos ad-free by signing up to the CuriosityStream Nebula Bundle deal right now. It's linked down below. Now, in the past, we made a few different videos discussing potential electoral pacts and alliances. And the argument often goes that as Labour have been out of power for 12 years, they need to start looking for some creative solutions to their number 10 problem. In fact, it's often speculated that if only they simply formed an electoral alliance with the Greens, SNP and Liberal Democrats, then they could actually win an election, and Starmer could move into Downing Street. However, this big multi-party solution is not ideal for Labour. After all, Starmer would have to sign himself up for all of the policies of the parties within his pact. And sure, he could try and distance himself a bit, but ultimately the media could and would conflate Labour and Starmer with, for example, the SNP's stance on the union. However, just last week, an arguably more favourable version of an electoral pact has been shown to be workable. That's because polling has shown that an electoral pact between just Labour and the Liberal Democrats could be enough. In fact, that specific electoral pact might not only be enough to get Labour into number 10, but also keep the Tories out for a long time to come. Before we get into how this plan could keep the Tories out of power for a long time coming, let's first tackle how Labour could actually get into power first. As I said in the intro, new MRP polling from Best for Britain found that 33% of people said that they would vote for Labour today, while 26% would vote Conservative. And this translates to 336 votes for Labour and 230 seats for the Conservatives. This is obviously good news for Labour, and suggests that no electoral pact is necessary, right? Well, sort of. Firstly, this polling might be a little optimistic for Labour, and that's because it was conducted between the 6th and 14th of April this year. Now, this is very relevant, because it means that polling was conducted during various Conservative scandals, including the Partygate scandal, while still happening before Beergate had gained any traction. As such, these were probably the most favourable conditions for Labour possible, and also the least favourable for the Conservatives. Secondly, while the polling I just shared focuses on the big two parties, the UK has a first-past-the-post system, which means that while they often struggle to win, smaller parties can have a big impact on vote share. In a close race, for instance, smaller parties on the same side of the political spectrum can take crucial votes from the major parties, allowing the large party on the other side of the aisle to actually win, even if a majority of voters in the constituency voted for left-wing candidates. And that's why pacts become so important. For example, Reform UK, formerly the Brexit Party, stood aside for the Conservatives in many tight seats in 2017 and 2019, preventing vote splitting and ensuring that a right-wing party would still win. And that ultimately granted the Tories much more headroom in both elections. Now, the poll I mentioned earlier from Best for Britain assumed that Reform UK would be standing, and as such, they'd be draining votes from the Conservatives. This means that in their model, the Tories suffered more than they have in previous elections. And considering that they stood down the last two times, it's entirely possible that Reform will stand by again, giving Johnson an unexpected boost. To try and balance this out, Best for Britain ran the numbers on what they call the worst case scenario for Labour, where they assume that Reform UK will stand down and 100% of their voters switch their votes to the Tories. Now, that's obviously an unrealistically high switching rate, but even still, we do see the Tories gain 31 seats, taking 29 from Labour. In this case, Labour's lead would drop far enough that they'd end up relying on the SNP, which isn't ideal for Starmer. Another option, though, is that the Lib Dems and Greens stand down for Labour in order to counterbalance the effect of Reform UK. If that were to happen, though, it's been calculated that while the Tories would gain 29 seats due to Reform standing down, they'd then lose 20 due to the Lib Dems and Greens standing down. Overall then, Labour would settle on about 322 seats and the Conservatives on 241. That's significant too, because it means that while Labour would have to form a coalition with the Lib Dems, they wouldn't need the SNP, which is their real difficulty here. However, for that to actually work, members of the Labour Party, Lib Dems and Greens would all need to be in favour of it. But fortunately for those on the left, it seems like they are. 54% of Labour members backed the anti-Tory pact, as did 56% of Lib Dem members and a huge 74% of Green members. So it seems that some sort of alliance between Labour, the Lib Dems and Greens could be good for Labour, but it could prove to be disastrous for the Conservatives. Sure, that might sound hyperbolic. After all, the Tories have been in power and looked unbeatable for a while now. But this specific arrangement is especially dangerous to the Conservatives. Why? Well, it's the thing that Tories dread the most: electoral reform. Now, the UK's electoral system is pretty suboptimal. Sure, we can have an argument about the benefits of the first-past-the-post system, things like 1 MP per constituency and majority governments, but many academics around the world do agree that the UK's model isn't all that representative or even that democratic. And that sounds bad, right? So why hasn't the system been changed? Well, and at the risk of being reductive, it's never changed because it doesn't advantage the governing party. If you've just been elected under a system which granted you a majority, then why would you change the rules? You're winning anyway at that point. So it's perhaps unsurprising that those suffering the unrepresentative challenges of the first-past-the-post system are also the ones who object to it the most. Think of parties like the Lib Dems and Reform UK, who have their vote share decimated by the system. However, Labour and the Tories have far less incentive to change a system which works for them to anything more representative. So you might be thinking, that does make sense, but if Starmer were to win, then why would he want to change the rules? Surely he'd be like every other leader and just enjoy the status quo. Well, firstly, at least based on this modelling, even if he did make it into power, he wouldn't do it with a huge majority. Other leaders, like previous Labour PM Tony Blair, like the idea of changing the electoral system until that system swept them to victory. But that's unlikely to happen to Starmer. And having come out of 15 years of opposition to a minority victory, it's easy to see why Starmer's Labour government might still thirst for change. Secondly though, and perhaps more importantly, look at his proposed coalition partners, the Lib Dems. As I mentioned a moment ago, they love electoral reform. It's one of their key policies. So they're not going to go into a coalition without some strong promises here. In 2010, they did team up with the Tories on the promise of a referendum on electoral reform. But following their loss there, and then again in the 2015 election, they're likely to be a little more insistent this time round. As such, it feels likely that a Labour-Lib Dem coalition, or even a minority Labour government supported by the other smaller parties, is going to be very incentivised to make changes. And at the moment, that kind of Labour victory doesn't look impossible. And if it were to materialise, the Tories ought to be concerned that with the rules of the game changed, they could be out of power for a while now. In fact, the Electoral Reform Society have modelled out every single election in the post-war era, and they've seen who would have won under an STV model, the Lib Dems' preferred electoral system. And their findings show that in only 2 elections would the Tories have won with a majority. Now, that's more than a slight downgrade, and even leaves Thatcher failing to govern alone. In fact, under STV, Corbyn's Labour would have actually beaten May in 2017, although not with a majority. Anyway, while the Conservatives might have got good at mobilising about 40% of the population and then winning in a fairly undivided right, in most elections, a majority of people want more left-leaning and centrist parties, which doesn't bode well for the Conservatives were electoral systems to be shifted. You've likely heard us talk about our streaming service Nebula before, but it's at its lowest price ever right now. So give me 1 minute to explain to you why you should care. And as always with TLDR, there's 3 reasons. Firstly, signing up to Nebula gets you a ton of additional TLDR content. We release some of our videos exclusively on Nebula, and those are full-length proper videos, as well as a super fun studio tour. We also release longer versions of some of our videos. In fact, we release a longer version of our show, The Daily Briefing, on Nebula every single day. That's a lot more TLDR for you every day. Secondly, everything on Nebula is ad-free. And that's not just TLDR either. That's all of your favorite creators like Wendover Productions, Real Life Law, Polymatter, Legal, Half as Interesting, and tons of others. And it's all ad-free. So there's no mid-rolls, and I wouldn't even be talking to you right now. Thirdly, signing up and watching on Nebula really helps the channel. And here's the maths. TLDR viewers signing up to Nebula has significantly improved our ability to monetize our content, which has allowed us to begin employing more staff and investing in new technology to improve our content. You might not notice it quite yet, but you soon will, and signing up is super helpful to make that possible. So, you're convinced, right? Did I do it in a minute? Who knows, it's pre-recorded. But anyway, if you did want to sign up for Nebula, the cheapest way to do so is with the CuriosityStream Nebula bundle deal. That way, if you sign up to CuriosityStream at the crazy low price of $11.59 a year, then you'll also get free access to Nebula as long as you're a paying member. That's right, 2 streaming services for less than $1 a month. And by the way, that crazy low price only lasts for this week. And it's worth saying that CuriosityStream is awesome. It contains absolutely boatloads of high-quality documentaries on all kinds of topics that I know that TLDR viewers are going to love. So if you want both services for $11.59 a year, this week only, then the link is down below. And if not, well, I can't say I haven't tried to convince you. Thanks for your support.